Hello and welcome to NewsHour live from the BBC World Service in London with me, Rebecca Kesby. Today, another bloodless political coup in Australia as the Liberals replace moderate Malcolm Turnbull with the more socially conservative Scott Morrison. We'll hear from the opposition Labour Party on that. Also, Ireland prepares for its first papal visit in 40 years, but even amongst the many faithful, there are critics.
I would love the Pope to change the horrible church language that it uses against LGBTI people. We are flesh and blood, human beings. We're no different from the Pope. And we'll also be hearing from the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, this hour. Plus a brutally honest report on the grim conditions inside one of Sierra Leone's filthy and overcrowded prisons. That's coming in about 20 minutes. But let's begin with the news that Australia has a new Prime Minister, the fifth in 5 years and the fourth since 2010 to be removed from office, not by the electorate, but by his own party colleagues. Former Finance Minister Scott Morrison of the Liberal Party takes on the job with less than a year to go till the next general elections. He replaces Malcolm Turnbull, who stood down as Prime Minister today after a political coup he called an insurgency. A faction within the centre-right Liberal Party were unhappy with his more moderate policies. As he stepped down, Mr Turnbull said he would leave Parliament altogether and accused those who'd plotted against him of pursuing a selfish agenda at the expense of the national good.
With politics, it's not about the politicians. That's why this week has been so dispiriting, because it just appears to be, vengeance, personal ambition, factional feuding, whatever you describe it. Hasn't had anything to do with 25 million Australians. And, the Australians we should be focused on, above all else, are these little ones. It is the next generation that we are working for here in this place.
Well, Scott Morrison takes on the party now, which has been at war with itself all week. He called for unity.
Our job is to ensure that we not only bring our party back together, which has been bruised and battered this week, but that will enable us to ensure we bring the Parliament back together, that we can continue to work to ensure that our country stays close together.
Well, there's been a lot of column inches devoted to all this in Australia. Commentators and politicians from other parties have criticised the self-indulgent narcissism of some, as some have called it, of the government when there are more important issues facing Australia, not least the current nationwide drought. This is what the leader of the Australian Green Party had to say about that, Senator Richard de Natale.
We've got people who can't afford to pay their medical bills right now. We've got young people who are being priced out of an education. There are 100,000 people in this country who are homeless. There are women who fear going home tonight because one woman a week is killed at the hands of a violent partner. And what have we got? We've got this spectacle, this disgrace.
Well, let's get some analysis on all this now. I've been speaking to Annabelle Crabb. She's a journalist with the ABC in Sydney, and she told me more about the new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
Scott Morrison has been the treasurer of our country for the last nearly 5 years, but he's best known for being the architect of what we call the Stop the Boats strategy under former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. He helped design and enforce the hardline border protection strategy that faced down people smugglers around Australia and eventually reduced the flow of boat arrivals to Australian coastlines to nil. Now, that is a significant part of this Conservative government's legacy, and he is a key architect of it. In the last 3 years, he's been serving under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who is a much more socially moderate figure. He was the Prime Minister who presided over the introduction of legalised same-sex marriage in this country, and he is a person who is much more associated with activism on climate change.
Yes, that some are saying that was his undoing, actually. Is that something Scott Morrison's going to continue with, or will he put that to one side?
Look, that is a huge question, and Malcolm Turnbull, who has been involved in conservative politics in this country for 15 years, and for that time has been a square peg in a round hole. I mean, he is more socially progressive than the Conservative Party that he has led now on 2 occasions, which have each ended in his expulsion by the party that he leads. Scott Morrison, who becomes today Australia's 30th Prime Minister, is more conservative. He is less of an activist on climate change, although I think he's unlikely to proselytise on the issue of climate change. I think he is, judging from his opening remarks as Prime Minister today in his first press conference, he is going straight for a hip pocket message, lower power prices, empathising with Australian families who are doing it tough, looking for a way to hand back more to Australian families by way of tax cuts and so on.
Annabelle, given the revolving door nature of Australian leadership, political leadership at the moment, though, can Scott Morrison rely on his party to get behind him? Because he only beat Peter Dutton, who was the other potential candidate on the second vote. He only beat him by 5 votes. I think it was 40 to 45. Doesn't that indicate that the party's still pretty divided, actually?
Do you know, I can't even explain to you what an odd week it's been, and it's essentially not really been about policy issues at all. I mean, for the first time that I can remember in the last 10 years, we have disposed of 4 prime ministers who are sitting mid-term by the hands of their own colleagues. This is a very atypical pattern in Australian history, and all of those removals have been on some policy issue or another. This one really seems to be more about the culture of the Conservative Party. They have thrown out a man with whom essentially they've never been terribly comfortable. Malcolm Turnbull is a very wealthy guy. He was the leader of the Republic campaign many years ago in Australia that was, as you probably recall, unsuccessful. And I think that this is a revolt against this man finally, and a casting out. I suspect that the new Prime Minister of Australia won't have as many cultural issues with his own party. What he may have is a completely cheesed off electorate who are tired of Prime Ministers being thrown out without their say-so.
Journalist Annabelle Crabb with the ABC in Sydney there. Well, many commentators are predicting all this will play very well for the opposition Labour Party, which despite its own internal battles in recent years, has had the same leader, Bill Shorten, since 2013. So are they celebrating the struggles of their political rivals? Josh Wilson is a Labour MP in Western Australia. I asked him if he was cock-a-hoop with the events in Australia this week.
I'm not cock-a-hoop. It's a terrible state of affairs that we've got ourselves into. It's not good for Australia as a nation. It doesn't reflect well on our parliamentary system, and it's a habit we have to break. We can't continue to have instability and changes of leadership, and the way this has unfolded this week, I think, has been a massive disappointment to everyone in the Australian community.
Lots of people, though, are saying it's going to hand the leadership to Labour ultimately. Your country's got to go to the polls, to the general electorate within the next few months, and Malcolm Turnbull standing down from Parliament might actually force a by-election even before that.
That may be, and certainly when you have a government that only has a one-seat majority, it makes the events of this week even more difficult to believe. I mean, it's a situation that has been hugely disappointing and rich in irony. It's been driven by the Conservatives within the Liberal Party, yet those same Conservatives seem to have very little respect for the traditions of good governance within a parliamentary system. And it's hard to understand exactly what has provoked the change that's occurred. I suppose it's in the nature of self-inflicted injuries that, you know, if you take a big hammer and nail your foot to the floor, you're going to walk around in circles, and that seems to be what's going on here.
Well, you're critical of the Liberal Party for its infighting, but it's not the only party that savages its own leader, is it? Look at your own party and the historic spat between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd.
Absolutely, and all of us in the Labor Party have to reflect on that. We continue to do so. It was not a period where we can look back on with anything other than regret, but we've made some changes. We've made structural changes within the way the Labor Party works, and we've made, just as importantly, we've made cultural changes.
You say you've made changes in the Labour Party as a result of your own infighting. What sort of changes?
Well, they're changes, they're sort of, I suppose you describe them as mechanical changes within the way our caucus works. There's a higher threshold test, I suppose, to trigger a leadership change than there used to be, and that means that you're not likely to see the kinds of things that have happened this week to the Liberal Party. But just as important, I think, are those cultural changes, and we need that kind of cultural change in Australia more broadly. We need to snap out of this phase which has seen us have 5 or 6 prime ministers in the last 6 or 7 years.
Would you be able to point to any one thing that may have made that change in Australian politics, as you're calling it a phase? But I suppose some people would say it's something that's also happened elsewhere in the world. In the UK, in the USA, you've got the two major parties deeply divided. Perhaps it's not just a thing that's affecting Australian politics.
I think that's a fair observation, and I don't want to hold myself out as a sort of an expert on all of the factors that might have contributed to that, but I think there are some things we can say have been part of it. I think the modern media cycle has brought a different kind of focus to leadership and politics. It's hastened everything. It's made everything fair game to some degree. I think in parliamentary systems, we would do well to remember that it's not just about the Prime Minister, and that if a government needs to face up to challenges, it needs to face up to them together in the tradition of good cabinet government, and that if things get difficult, whether it's in the polls or with policy, you should take that on. You should resolve to deal with that as best you can, rather than going for the quick fix and indulging in what has occurred here, which really has been a combination, I would say, of vengeance and self-aggrandisement that allows people to convince themselves that the solution is to chop down an elected Prime Minister.
That was Labour MP Josh Wilson there, speaking to us a short time ago from Australia. And if you want more details on this story, you can find them at bbc.com/news. Still to come on NewsHour, we'll be hearing about a BBC investigation that has uncovered evidence that many Rohingya girls in refugee camps in Bangladesh are suffering various forms of exploitation.
When I was young, I never thought I'd marry an old man. Now I've had to marry one. I'm worried that now I'm carrying a baby, and I'm worried that this old man will die. And how then will I raise my child?
More on that to come, and a reminder of our top headlines this hour. Spain's government has approved a decree allowing the remains of the fascist dictator General Franco to be exhumed from a monument honouring those who died in the Spanish Civil War. And as we've just been hearing, Scott Morrison has become Australia's new Prime Minister after Malcolm Turnbull was forced out in a leadership contest. This is Rebecca Kesby with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. Human rights campaigners in Sierra Leone say the country's justice system is fraught with many challenges and are asking the new government for reforms. Key to this is the justice sector. Since the end of the Civil War 16 years ago now, the country has struggled to set up courts across the country, which has had serious consequences for the prisons, which are grossly overcrowded. Recently, shocking images secretly taken inside one of the prisons in the south drew outrage from the public. The BBC has been granted exclusive access inside the prison in Bo, from where Umara Fufana sent us this report, and a warning, it does contain some details which are pretty distressing.
Welcome to the Bo prison. Well, it is actually called the Correctional Center, but it is anything but correctional. Here, the air hangs heavy, with a cocktail stench of filth, human excreta and urine.
I want to welcome you to the Bo Male Correctional Center. This center was built in colonial days.
It was built for 80 inmates, but like almost all other prisons in the country, it now holds over 3 times its capacity. James Kapro-Tarawale is a regional prison commander.
Overcrowding is really our issue at present. And as of today, as you have seen, we have 244 inmates in our custody.
70% of the trial inmates here have not even been indicted, and many of them have been behind bars for years. The walls are bedaubed with what looks like blood stains. The inmates say they are blood of bedbugs and even fecal substance. During the day, inmates use unsightly pit latrines with broken doors that are barely hanging. At night, they have to make do with plastic buckets inside their overcrowded cells, which they use in turns. This place typifies the prisons in Sierra Leone. This tiny cell here holds 15 inmates. It's hot, it's smelly, because for 14 hours every day, they use inside this room as their toilet. Many of the inmates look emaciated and have developed scabies and other skin diseases. Some are very sick with swollen legs. Their clinic, where they are meant to receive treatment, is a tiny room that can barely fit in a table and a chair. The shelves hold very few medicines.
Visitors in! And all other female officers!
It is better inside the female prison, but only just. There, inmates are also overcrowded. A 1-year-old baby crawls on the bare rugged floor inside the cell. The babies have had to be brought inside the prison despite their mothers having committed what are generally called misdemeanors. The country's Criminal Procedures Act does not provide for alternatives to detention or fines like suspended or deferred sentencing or even community service. Many say this is in clear violation of the UN Standard Minimum Rules for Non-Custodial Measures, otherwise called the Tokyo Rules, an issue which the relevant government minister promises to take up with the Attorney General.
I can see for myself the reports about the hearing.
On tour of the facility for the first time, that new Minister of Internal Affairs, Edward Soloku, says he's appalled by what he has seen.
More than shocking. The delay in terms of giving judgment by the judiciary. Some people have been in remand for over 1 year. There are also people, especially 1 or 2 people who have been here for over 10, 15 years. No records on them. I've told them to furnish my office with all details about inmates in their custody.
Campaigners say the country's entire prison service is broken. Prison Watch monitors prison conditions across the country, and they've been sounding the alarm for some time now. Mambu Feka is its executive director.
It's quite appalling. It needs to be fixed because it's broken. You'll be shocked to know that, in fact, people on traffic offenses and misdemeanor are populating the prisons more than any other person else.
There is only 1 truck to transport prisoners in the whole of southern Sierra Leone. Without a lockup or a toilet for the courts, male and female prisoners on trial are crammed inside it all day, and they also use it as their toilet. Despite the harsh conditions, there is room for music. Back to the female prison, these women are singing us goodbye. But at the moment, it seems it's the justice and prison systems that are in urgent need of rehabilitation if these prisoners are to be given another start in life.
Umaru Fufana in Sierra Leone there. Now, the Spanish government has announced that it will authorise the removal of the remains of the former fascist dictator General Francisco Franco from the Valley of the Fallen, a space he commissioned to bury the dead from the civil war in the 1930s. The decision still needs to get voted through Parliament. Franco died in 1975, an old man in power to the end, but his tomb has become a focal point for modern-day fascist groups wanting to glorify his military dictatorship. So why has Spain never really laid to rest the old ghosts from the past? I've been speaking to history professor Angel Binas. Firstly, he told me more about the site of the Valley of the Fallen.
The Valley of the Fallen is a valley very near Madrid, 35 kilometers away, more or less, where Franco decided in 1940 to erect a monument to the glory of the people killed in the war on his side. It took almost 18 years to build, and it was inaugurated, so to speak, in 1959. And there lie the remains of some 40,000 people.
This valley then does hold an important place for Spanish society, but also this entire issue is about Spain's uncomfortable relationship with its past, isn't it?
Absolutely. Spain is one of the few countries in Western Europe which has not come to terms with its history.
Part of the issue has been that this monument still serves as a focal point for those who share General Franco's views, modern-day supporters of neo-fascism, but also his family have been very unhappy about the thought that his remains could be moved. They've even appealed to the Pope, I think. What sort of support have they had?
I suppose that they have very little support. Mind you, politically speaking, more than a year ago, there was a motion tabled by the opposition parties in the Spanish parliament asking for the removal of Franco's remains. If my memory is correct, only one single MP voted against. The party of the government, the Conservative Party, abstained. So the motion was carried by an enormous majority. But the government wasn't forced legally to do anything about this non-law proposition no delay. What the government is doing now is to act on that motion was tabled a year ago.
Some people are suspicious about the timing of this. I suppose enough time has gone past, which means it's easier to deal with than perhaps in previous years. But also, some people are looking at this as being a little bit of opportunism by the Spanish government at the moment, because they do have a very slender majority in Parliament. They're struggling to get through any of their economic policies or any other social policies they're looking at. This is something that they can get through Parliament, and it's a way of bringing some sort of success, I suppose, to the government at the moment.
I beg to disagree for one simple reason. The government by itself, or the party in government, the Socialist Party, wouldn't be able to carry this motion on its own. It needs support from other parties in Parliament.
And where do you believe that his remains may go after this?
They will obviously be treated in a dignified manner, that is for sure. My suggestion would be to inter Franco's remains next to his wife's. In Italy, this is what has happened to Mussolini's remains. They were put after many very idiosyncratic courses in the family's crypt.
And that was history professor Angel Binyas speaking to me earlier.
Now on the BBC World Service, Global Beats takes a quiet trip to a Finnish music festival.
I am Ida Kiljander. I'm a singer and a music teacher. I'm also a lover of heavy metal. I'm here at the Tuska Metal Festival in Helsinki, Finland, which is also my home country.
This Viking thing going on, I know it's very cliche, but there's something that matches that genre.
I am going to be introducing you to some of my country, Finland's exciting metal bands, and exploring why this genre of rock music is so incredibly popular here in Finland.
Heavy metal became, let's say, mainstream when the Finnish band Lordi won the Eurovision Song Contest.
Here in Finland, all the guys go to the army. I don't think anybody could stay sane in the army without listening to Slayer. You really wind down with Slayer rather than, say, Spice Girls.
Global Beats, heavy metal in Finland at bbcworldservice.com.
Still to come on NewsHour, the first papal visit to Ireland in 40 years, but what sort of reception will the Pope get in a country no longer so loyal to Rome as it once was? Also a disturbing report from Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, where many young women and girls face exploitation, and concern about the missing radioactive device in Malaysia. Apparently it's not the first time one's gone missing. First the news.
BBC News. The Spanish cabinet has passed a decree authorising the removal of the remains of the fascist dictator General Franco from a monument to those who died in the Spanish Civil War. Fascists used the site near Madrid as a place of pilgrimage. The decree will still need parliamentary approval. More than 130 MPs from Southeast Asia have urged the UN Security Council to take Myanmar to the International Criminal Court over its treatment of the Rohingyas. It comes a year after Myanmar security forces drove more than 700,000 members of the Muslim minority into neighbouring Bangladesh. Australia's new Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said he'll work to reunite his divided Liberal Party and bring the country together. Mr Morrison was sworn in hours after his predecessor Malcolm Turnbull was forced out of office by party rivals in a bruising leadership contest. He's the country's sixth Prime Minister in less than 10 years. The World Health Organization says a doctor infected with Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo is in an area entirely surrounded by rebels. The doctor is in hospital in the eastern town of Aicha, which is surrounded by Ugandan Islamist militia. Reports from Yemen say a number of civilians, including children, have been killed in a missile strike. Houthi rebels and the Saudi-led coalition are blaming each other for the attack near the city of Hodeidah. Uganda's former chief of police has been charged with arming a vigilante group and forcibly repatriating Rwandan refugees. General Kale Kaihura was sacked by President Museveni in March. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. The former manager of Arsenal Football Club, Arsene Wenger, has been awarded Liberia's highest honour today. Mr Wenger used to manage the ex-international football star turned Liberian President George Weah at Monaco.
Coming up next, how will Ireland welcome the Pope? It's still a nation of Catholics, but the Irish Prime Minister tells us the Church no longer has the influence it once did in the country. That's to come, but first, our daily look at the world of business. And the household products company Procter & Gamble has applied to trademark acronyms that are in common usage in the world of texting. Now, young people won't need me to explain, but for anyone over 30-ish, we're talking about acronyms such as LOL, which means laugh out loud, and NBD, no big deal, apparently. So how would that work in practice? Is it possible to trademark common words? I've been speaking to Martin Hayden, a patent and trademark attorney in London.
The question that we're actually asking is, can we use things that we say on a daily basis as labels for products or services? Because that's what Procter & Gamble has done. It appears that it's applied to register a trademark. And what that is an official right that's associated with the source of a product or a service. So it says if you see LOL on a cleaning product, then what you've got there is a Procter & Gamble product. And the use of common terms or words to associate products with companies is fairly well known.
Exactly. Without wanting to give anyone any undue advertising, people might be thinking of Apple. There's certainly lots of cleaning products that use the word clean or some sort of Mr. Clean I can think of. Why is this different then?
I don't know that it is that different. It's an opportunistic move. It might even be a very clever thing to do, to pick up on a contemporary term or phrase that's being used in general usage that has no specific meaning relating to your product and attach it to it. I mean, there's another very well-known mark that's got the word bang in it.
Right, also a cleaning product.
Also a cleaning product and also registered.
So legally then, when it comes to using these words, is it possible to patent the actual words or is it the context in which they're used?
What the registration doesn't do is stop anyone using that term anywhere in normal language. So there's no problem here, even if P&G are successful in registering these, that you can no longer put LOL at the bottom of your emails or text messages.
Yes, I should think so. But given what we know about these things in the past and the precedents already set, these haven't been granted yet, but are they likely to be?
This is a US application and so covers the US only, and the standards that the US applies to registration of the mark often differs to other countries. Could it be registered? I think it could.
So, of course, all of this, from an industry point of view, is really to try and lock in the usage of these terms before anybody else does, any of your competitors. But can you tell us a little bit more about the context in terms of whether it's only within the certain product range or whether it's any range?
You do actually have to, at the time of registration, say what sort of product is being associated with that particular mark. So registering LOL for cleaning products doesn't have any impact, for example, on computers.
Martin Hayden there with TMI. Too much information, my young colleagues tell me, possibly there. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Rebecca Kesby. 40 years ago, when Pope John Paul II visited Ireland, more than 1.5 million people, that was nearly half the country, went to see him speak and preside over an open-air mass. Now, another pope is coming to Ireland this weekend. Pope Francis will be in the country. But the reception he gets may be very different to his predecessors. Of course, Ireland still has many observant Catholics, but the institution of the Church has been devastated by a series of sexual abuse scandals, and even its own clergy have admitted that the Church's credibility there is in tatters. Paul Moss reports from Dublin.
They had quite literally been putting out the bunting when I visited Dublin's Capuchin Day Centre for the homeless. It was lunchtime and hundreds of meals were being dished up for the city's poor huddled masses. This is quite an operation at the best of times, but right now they're also preparing for a very special visitor, because on Saturday 80 of these homeless people will be joined at dinner by Pope Francis, and the fact that the Pope will break bread here tells you all you need to know about the man, according to the director of the centre, Father Sean Donohoe.
This is a man who wants to be where the poor are really present. Coming in here, I'm excited, probably a little bit apprehensive that everything will go well. From a personal point of view, it's something I never dreamt would happen in my lifetime for me to meet a Pope.
We are family. Well, this is a rather different kind of preparation for the Pope's visit. I'm outside a hall in the south of Dublin where they're holding a conference on the role of the family, a conference which the Pope is due to attend. But as you could probably hear, there are people singing outside. They're a lesbian and gay choir protesting against the Catholic Church and what they say is its attitude to homosexuality.
My name is Ursula Halligan. I'm one of the organisers of the Rainbow Choir. I am a Catholic, I'm a person of faith. It really upset me that my church were describing us as objectively disordered and our love as intrinsically evil, and that they didn't even recognise LGBTI families as real families. I would say to the Pope, please, we need to see actions.
Well, what sort of action do you want him to take?
I would love the Pope to change the horrible church language that it uses against LGBTI people. We are flesh and blood, human beings. We're no different from the Pope.
In some ways, this quarrel isn't new. The cause of sexual liberation has never exactly seen eye to eye with the Vatican. But the newer development, the development which really hangs over this forthcoming papal visit, is the series of revelations which showed that thousands of children were abused by Ireland's Catholic priests. The victims, and those who campaign on their behalf, are determined their voices will be heard in the coming days.
I have no difficulty at all with the idea that 500,000 people will go along on Sunday to the papal mass and celebrate their faith. All I want is the truth.
Colm O'Gorman is among the organisers of a protest march this Sunday, timed to coincide with the Pope celebrating Mass in Dublin. He himself was repeatedly raped by a priest when he was a teenager.
This is a country that has been devastated by abuse that's been perpetrated by the Church. Rape, sadistic sexual violence. Children were starved. Francis, when he talks about a cover-up, speaks half-truth. He has never said that by willful intent and design, the Vatican worked to cover up the crimes of its clergy in the interest of protecting the institution, its power and its money.
Like St. Patrick, I too have heard the voice of the Irish
It was so different the last time a pope came here. When John Paul II visited Ireland in 1979, he was coming to a country whose only idea of clerical scandal was the occasional parish priest turning out to be not quite celibate. But more than that, it was an Ireland where 8 or 9 out of 10 people went to Mass every week. And long should that adherence to the faith continue, John Paul II told them.
May I express a wish that every home in Ireland may remain a home of daily family prayer.
He was whistling in the wind. Religiosity has gone into steep decline in Ireland, to the point where going to Mass is now a minority pursuit. This is often attributed to the abuse scandals. It's left then to the country's priests to try to resuscitate Irish Catholicism. St Teresa's Church in the centre of Dublin has a pragmatic approach to pulling in worshippers. It aims to provide a sanctuary for passers-by, wearied by that secular trinity of work, play and shopping. But the resident prior here, Father Jim Noonan, remains convinced that the papal visit this weekend can help to make church attendance in Ireland something more than that, perhaps even, once again, an Irish national custom.
The Pope can certainly help in the process of what Ireland is going through at the moment. He's a very good communicator, and I'd be hopeful that some things will begin to change after this visit and that people may be open again to looking at the church maybe in a new way.
That was Father Jim Noonan ending that report by Paul Moss in Dublin. Well, we can hear now from the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar. He's been speaking to our religious affairs editor, Martin Bashir, and Martin began by asking him how the relationship between Ireland and the Church has changed in the 40 years since the last papal visit.
I think it's fair to say that Ireland is increasingly diverse, increasingly secular, a much more liberal country, a much more globally outward-looking country than maybe it was 40 years ago. And the relationship with the Church has changed, principally because of so many revelations that have occurred around child sex abuse, for example, but also some of the institutions that were run by the Catholic Church in the past. And that has caused people, I believe, to look at the Catholic Church in a different way. Having said that, even in our most recent census, which was only a few years ago, 78% of Irish people still identify as Catholic, and millions of people are regular Mass-goers. And these events around the papal visit will be attended by maybe 750,000 Irish people, which makes it the biggest event that's happened in the country in a very long time. So I think if I were to sum it up, I'd say that the Catholic Church is still very much part of our society, but not at the centre of it in the way that it was 40 years ago.
Are you glad that the Church is having less of a dominant effect?
The short answer is yes. I think in the past the Catholic Church had too much of a dominant place in Irish society. I think it still has a place in Irish society, but not one that determines public policy or determines our laws. It can certainly express views and contribute to the debate, as all organisations do, but not in a way that determines public policy, in a way it would have done in the past. Former Prime Ministers, I am going back a few decades now, would have consulted bishops about issues of public policy, about health service reform, for example. That's no longer the case. But I wouldn't like people to think that when we talk about Ireland being a more secular place, that we're a country without values or spirit or faith. We do have values. We believe in things like equality before the law, community, family, enterprise, social justice, individual liberty. So we're still very much a country of values, even if they're not entirely the values of the Catholic Church. And this Pope in particular, who's taken a real interest in things like caring for the poor and things like protecting the planet, I think speaks to a lot of people.
Does the Church, in your view, need to amend its doctrines, its orthodoxy, particularly, for example, as it relates to the LGBT community?
I was brought up as a Catholic, but I'm not somebody who's religious. But I do know that there are a lot of people who are religious, who hold very deep and very heartfelt religious views and Catholic views, and many of them, women, people who are gay or lesbian, people who are divorced, feel very excluded from their own church and would like to see doctrine and rules change. And the Catholic Church has changed its doctrine over the centuries, even though it doesn't always admit to the extent to which it has done that. But I'm very firmly of my view that me as Prime Minister, me as head of government, it's not my role to be saying to any religion that they should change their doctrine.
That was the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, speaking to the BBC's Martin Bashir there. Now, as we were listening to that, we can say that the Constitutional Court in Zimbabwe has begun delivering its ruling on the opposition party's challenge to the election in July. We can hear now Chief Justice Luke Malaba is just delivering his judgment now.
For instance, what is alleged to have happened in Mashonaland West.
Okay, so that's been going on over the past 20 minutes or so. We've got people listening across it to bring you the latest on the ruling. One other person who I know is watching it carefully is the MDC Alliance opposition representative to the EU, Grace Quinger, who joins us live from Brussels right now. Grace, you're with the opposition party, and I know this is very important to you. What have you heard the judge say so far?
Well, so far it's not really looking good. So while on the one hand they say that the application was defective, it didn't meet on the technicality of the 7 days within which it should have been applied. It has been granted, however, because of the nature of the importance of the nature of the case to national interest. However, just listening to some of the issues being brought up so far, it does not look good at all.
So your understanding, and as I say, we're still watching this because it's quite long and drawn out, but he has to go through every point, which is legally very important. But it sounds as if on a number of technicalities, the Constitutional Court is going to reject this challenge from the opposition MDC. What do you believe your party's move will be next? Is it time to accept the election result, or will you try and appeal?
Well, this battle is going on because there are a lot of the environment in which the court case was heard on Monday was a terrible environment.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
It undermined the trust that Zimbabweans have in the judiciary. It undermined the trust that Zimbabweans have in political processes. If you look at, for instance, at the fact that Nelson Chamisa's counsel was denied. That is Advocate Dalimpofu, who were going to be defending him. If you look, for instance, at the fact that the Vice President of Zimbabwe, Chiwenga, was already pronouncing that whatever happens in the courts is irrelevant. The inauguration of President Mnangagwa is going ahead. So the whole atmosphere was poisoned. And I would like to really say the MDC put up a good fight. The MDC has shown that they are willing to have change in Zimbabwe through democratic means.
Okay.
The MDC has in this process... Yes.
Yes, so just briefly, because we are running out of time, but the MDC isn't eliminated by this. You did pretty well in the elections. You still got seats in Parliament. You can continue to challenge the government in Parliament, but by accepting the vote and moving forward with the country, isn't that now what perhaps you ought to do?
I think the issue is accepting the vote. Moving on, yes, the MDC has several options at hand, but accepting this kind of fraud, I do not think that is ever going to happen. And of course, Mr. Mnangagwa and his new government are going to face the consequences of a stolen vote.
Okay, well, that's your view, and we thank you so much for joining us live as we're watching the judge give that delivery. We're going to keep across this story for you. That was Grace Quinger, MDC Alliance representative in the EU.
This is the BBC World Service, taking you from Havana to Kingston.
The BBC Proms presents a Caribbean party as Cuban salsa fuses with Jamaican reggae.
Listen to the BBC Proms at bbcworldservice.com. In 10 minutes, stay with us for Tech Tent.
A blow for Chinese giant Huawei as Australia bans the firm from building its 5G network. And following the Facebook data scandal, will people resist Silicon Valley firms moving into areas such as health and education? We talked to author Lucy Green, whose new book examines the question.
That's followed by World Business Report. Now it's back to NewsHour.
And a reminder of our top story this hour. Scott Morrison has become Australia's new Prime Minister after Malcolm Turnbull was forced out in a leadership contest. Speaking at a news conference, Mr Morrison said one of his main tasks would be to heal the rifts in his party.
Our job is to ensure that we not only bring our party back together, which has been bruised and battered this week, but that will enable us to ensure we bring the Parliament back together, that we can continue to work to ensure that our country stays close together. We're a resilient bunch, Australians. I mean, the fact that we have had the longest running economic success of any nation in the world today is a tribute to the resilience of the Australian people.
And one more headline, Spain's government has approved a decree allowing the remains of the fascist dictator General Franco to be exhumed from a monument honouring those who died in the Spanish Civil War. You're with NewsHour live from the BBC in London with me, Rebecca Kesby. Now, Malaysian police have stepped up efforts to locate missing radioactive material, forming a round-the-clock task force to try and track down a device that disappeared from a pickup truck earlier this month. The vehicle was travelling just a few miles from the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur. Authorities there say the substance inside the device could spread dangerous radioactive contamination if handled improperly. Well, Amy Chu is the security correspondent for Channel News Asia in Kuala Lumpur, and she told me what we know about this missing device.
Well, this is a radioactive device. It weighs 23 kilos and it is used in the oil and gas industry for testing purposes. And this device contains the radioactive isotope iridium-192, one of the most stolen commercial radioactive isotopes. Basically, what happened was that this device had been used and rented out by this company, and the job was done. So two technicians loaded it back up onto a pickup truck. And so when this truck arrived back at the office, they discovered that this device has gone missing.
Presumably there were people driving this truck. Did they not notice anything suspicious?
There were two people, and these two people, they are the technicians of this company that rented out this device. They started searching for it. They started retracing their journey and they couldn't find it. And that's when they decided to lodge a police report. And the police at that time didn't quite believe their story given the circumstances. And these two technicians were actually detained for a couple of days. But after interrogation, they couldn't really find any evidence to be held against them, so they were released. And right now, this device is still missing. And also the UN has warned there is a risk when such devices go missing that it could fall into the hands of terrorists and be made to make a dirty bomb.
Well, this is the real fear, isn't it? Surely somebody needs to be held to account as to why there isn't a better scrutiny of where this machinery is and who's in control of it at any given time. You know, I mean, it sounds as if it's been allowed to fall off the back of a lorry.
Yes, we don't quite know who, is ultimately responsible for this. Even in other countries, like in Indonesia, for example, where I used to work there, they don't have much of a standard. I remember when I was doing a report on that, they were stored basically in just like an ordinary Tupperware.
And just briefly, Amy, whatever's happened to this device, does it pose any potential threat to anyone coming into contact with it, whoever may have it or whoever may find it?
An expert has come out to say that if this device is taken out of its casing, you can have radiation emitted up to a radius of 1.3 square kilometers. So the worry is not just only it falling into the hands of terrorists. You can even have an incident, of people coming into contact with it. They are curious. They could pick this up not knowing what it is, and they can also take it out of the casing. So, there are many different scenarios in which the radioactivity of this device is compromised.
Amy Chu, security correspondent for Channel News Asia. Now, it's a year since the Burmese military responded to Rohingya militant attacks on security posts with a brutal crackdown, described by the UN as bearing the hallmarks of ethnic cleansing. 1 year on, the United Nations Agency for Children, UNICEF, says 500,000 young Rohingya Muslim refugees from Myanmar risk becoming a lost generation. Meanwhile, 130 parliamentarians from Southeast Asia have urged the UN Security Council to take Myanmar to the International Criminal Court over this issue. Meanwhile, a BBC investigation has found that many Rohingya girls in the huge refugee camps in Bangladesh are suffering various forms of exploitation. Our Myanmar correspondent Nick Beak sent this special report from Cox's Bazar.
In a tiny shack in the biggest refugee camp in the world, Sonjida is cooking dinner. The light from the fire illuminates a scene the 15-year-old orphan could never have imagined a year ago. Then she was a schoolgirl in Myanmar. Now she's married and pregnant. An ID card dangles from the roof, bearing the image of her often absent husband. A wrinkled and white-bearded figure stares out. He's 66. With no family and no money, Sonjida says no younger man would marry her.
When I was young, I never thought I'd marry an old man. Now I've had to marry one. I'm worried that now I'm carrying a baby, and I'm worried that this old man will die. And how then will I raise my child?
Last August, video emerged apparently showing the Burmese army and Buddhist mobs unleashing fire on the Rohingya Muslims. A coordinated campaign of torture, rape and murder, say human rights groups, that forced hundreds of thousands to flee. A year on, nearly 1 million refugees remain trapped in the sprawling camps across the border in Bangladesh. Half of them are children. Their makeshift shelters, which were thrown together, now have a depressing permanence. There's little sign they'll be leaving soon. They may be fed by aid agencies, but they're not safe. Danger is all around. The weather, disease, exploitation. Day and night, my tears flow, Shakina tells us. Her 4 young sons sit around her in silence. She says she could only watch as the Burmese army murdered her husband last year in Myanmar. When they reached the supposed safety of the camps, her 13-year-old daughter Aisha disappeared. It's thought she was abducted by traffickers.
What happened to my daughter? Nobody knows. Only Allah can say. I don't think I'll ever see her again.
The crimes inflicted on the Rohingya last year are still destroying countless young lives. In a filthy, dark and dingy room in the nearby town of Cox's Bazar, we meet a 15-year-old who goes by the name Rosina. She perches on the edge of the bed, and from behind the veil that conceals her face, she begins to explain her harrowing story. She was forced into sex work after fleeing Myanmar and arriving in Bangladesh. Now, Rosina says, it's the only way to survive.
I want nothing else but to go back to Myanmar. I want to get my country back. I've left lots of relatives there. I hate it here. I loved life in Myanmar.
Aung San Suu Kyi's Myanmar claims it wants to bring these children back, but plenty doubt that. The fear is they'll be forgotten, and the many dangers they face ignored. A whole generation robbed of a future before their lives even began.